Kepler College is one of the oldest, reputable astrology schools in North America. We have one of the most comprehensive, award-winning educational programs with more than 60 faculty members offering live online instruction year-round. Get ready to celebrate 25 years of quality astrological education with us. Kepler College teaches a wide range of astrological techniques, history, philosophies, and disciplines for all levels, from those who are curious seekers to dedicated students and seasoned practitioners. Our instructors possess outstanding astrological skills and wisdom, from fresh, innovative voices to established leaders in astrology. Many of our diverse faculty have worked in the field for decades. When you enroll in Kepler College, you join a strong international community of peers and future colleagues. Our program provides a strong foundation for professional practice, postgraduate study, or self-understanding. After studying with Kepler College, many of our students evolve from learners to leaders, establishing their practice and making meaningful contributions to the astrological community. Chart your course in astrology today with Kepler College.
Wonderful. Introducing our esteemed presenter for today, Maurice Fernandez. Maurice is a leading evolutionary astrologer with a worldwide reputation of depth and excellence for his diploma program in astrology, publications, and consulting work. He is the recipient of Orion Award for Outstanding Contribution to Astrology and ESAR Community Service Award. He served as president of OPA for 3 consecutive terms. And for more information, you can go to Maurice's website at mauricefernandez.com. You can also join EA Sky's Astrology Discussion Group. This is a Facebook group, and I think we can pop that in the chat as well. And you can follow Maurice on Instagram at the handle on the screen there, and I think we can pop that in too. So Maurice, it's very much a privilege to have you here today. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass on the baton to you.
Many thanks and gratitude. It's great to be back at Kepler and share more information, more knowledge, more star knowledge. And indeed, today's presentation is on Mercury, understanding, I would say, Mercury beyond the retrograde, even though we're entering now a retrograde cycle as Mercury is about to turn back in the sign of Leo. We often underestimate, I feel, the presence, the meaning, and the importance of Mercury in our chart. So I'm going to hopefully, give more perspectives and insights into this. Even if there are things you already know about, it's good to refresh. And the reason I chose this topic is not just because I think it's important. Currently, the nodes are also in Virgo and Pisces, which speak to this, to the influence of Mercury during our whole 18-month of this cycle. So because Mercury is the ruler of a node, you will see, if you track its placement and its cycle, you will see how it affects the nodal dynamics as well. But I'm going to speak about that soon. But most, immediately, because the webinar that I'm going to teach on August 3rd is about vocational orientation and looking at how how we can be successful in our profession, how our charts can really direct us professionally. We see so many young people coming out of high school and not really knowing what they want to do next. So we see how astrology can be helpful and meaningful in this kind of orientation, but not only for people who are, about to study at college or universities, but also those of us who reinvent ourselves career-wise in the course of our adult life. Many people go through transitions. So our vocation is a soul dedication. Is it just work, or is it a higher calling? These are aspects of the influence that we're going to explore together. And Mercury, ruling the sign of Virgo, is immediately part of this, I would say, collection of signatures, an important factor in understanding how to direct ourselves professionally. And this is why I chose to start with Mercury, kind of set the tone for this coming workshop. And so those of you who will be signing up for the workshop, you'll also get the slides of this presentation to look back at and review. I hope this inspires you for yourself, understanding your own chart, but also if you're doing client work, it's imperative to really understand our professional development. And one thing I will add is that traditionally, we often look at the 10th house, the MC, as a career indicator. And it's obviously part of the equation. We have to consider the 10th house. But the way I approach this topic and explore the professional development and vocational orientation goes way beyond the 10th house. The 10th house is, I would say, a 10%, 15% of what our career is really about. And you can see that in the fact that many successful people, in whatever field, don't have a populated 10th house, empty 10th house. And quite often the sign of the 10th house does not represent the career or the job description that the person is. Sometimes it does, but I would say it's not a perfect formula that way. So we're going to really go deeper into understanding not just the practical aspects of profession, but also the spiritual, the soul, and all that's part of it. And again, a reason that I decided to choose this to offer this topic, and Kepler nailed it in that sense, is that the nodes are currently in Pisces Virgo, and there's so much development and changes with regards to professional development. And we see that, at least in the US, there are many changes with the Trump administration firing many people from their governmental jobs. And that reflects a lot of what's going on in the market. The markets are changing, and that impacts employment. So Virgo Pisces are immediately an axis that relates to employment. And so, yeah, hopefully we'll see you in August as well. Those of you who resonate with this line of study, with a perspective that brings soul with practical analysis, I invite you to look into the diploma program that I offer. It combines live sessions with existing material. And right now, I refer to this as the midterm enrollment, because there's a new cycle that will begin later this year, but you can join now as a midterm and enjoy the benefits of the current cycle and merge later into the new cycle. So it's all on my website. On a special deal for those who want to taste a bit more of what I offer, there is also a discount on dedicated webinars, astrology of animals, wildlife, pets, service animals, the death chart, what it means, when we cast a chart for the time someone is passing. So this is not about predicting death, but it's more about the actual chart and how it refers to the birth chart. So a lot of interesting topics that you can get a discount if you if you purchase them before until July 31st. And back to Mercury, here it is. I'm looking at the general map of our solar system. Obviously, the distances here are not to scale, but it gives you a general order to see. And what I want to demonstrate here is to show that Mercury and Venus are between the Earth and the Sun. So they're in a special category compared to the other planets from Mars to the outer edges of the solar system. And this is why Mercury and Venus, from our perspective on Earth, are always in proximity to the Sun in our birth charts. Think about it and how that immediately populates a particular quadrant of your chart. So if you have your sun in the 11th house, chances are Mercury and Venus will be either in the 12th or the 10th or the 11th. And so you already have 3 personal planets in one area of your chart. And this is very meaningful in general, but particularly in the light of more and more cesarean births in our culture, in our time, around the world, which means that more and more babies are born between 8 to 4 p.m., 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., which means that the sun is going to be between the 12th and the 8th, 9th house, which means Mercury is also going to be with Venus around those houses. And that kind of, affects our future, our culture, if we understand that there's going to be an imbalance of day to night births. And so the relationship of Mercury to the sun is critical. That's true for any planet, but particularly Mercury being the closest to the sun, and Mercury having this dance that we're going to explore with the sun. So I'm also looking at the natural order of the zodiac. Mercury rules 2 signs, Gemini and Virgo. I personally am of the school and of the opinion and experience that the sign does correlate to the house. So Gemini in the 3rd house, Virgo in the 6th house. I think it's very important. It's not just easy, as some people claim that it's an easy cop out to conflate house and sign, but I think it's just because it is very relevant and it's important in our analysis to understand the correlation between house and sign. And so Mercury ruling Gemini is also immediately associated with a natural ruler of the 3rd house. So there's a natural ruler, and then there's the sign ruler. If your 3rd house opens in Capricorn, then the ruler of the 3rd house will be Saturn. But Mercury remains the natural ruler of that house, and so it is for the 6th house. And that's important because, it's going to inform our analysis, but it's also important to understand the archetypes of the houses. Now, in astrology, what I find out is that we also tend to associate a lot of the Mercury meanings with the Gemini functions, such as, the communication and the ability, the transportation aspect of Mercury. But we often kind of forget that Mercury also rules Virgo and the sixth house, which means that it's immediately associated with our function and with organizing our lives and our skill sets, our professional development. And Mercury must be analyzed from a professional point of view. You're going to miss a lot of information if you don't include Mercury placement in your analysis of professional development. And so don't underestimate, the Virgo qualities of Mercury. I also associate Uranus and Aquarius associations as the higher octave of Mercury. So all personal planets, Mars, Venus, Mercury, represent how we establish our lives. And I call this how we come down from spirit into incarnation, into form. So the lower hemisphere, from first house to sixth house, Aries to Virgo, is all about making it and surviving, establishing ourselves in the physical material manifestation. And so it is spirit coming into flesh. It is spirit incarnating and being able to lead our lives down here. Then, as we move into the upper hemisphere, and especially as we reach the first higher octave, which is Pluto, this is when we ascend back to spirit. So in some ways, the Mars signs, Aries and Scorpio, are beginnings, new beginnings. The first Mars sign is the incarnation. It's the birth. It's the baby pushing out of the womb. Whereas the second Mars leads to Pluto as a transformative process where Pluto represents the underworld. But as we go through our eighth house, as we go through Scorpio, we have to change or die. And this is the beginning of a shift in our consciousness where from coming down into matter, into physical incarnation, we start to ascend back into spirit, meaning that we start to develop a spiritual perspective on our lives. And that's why Pluto is the first transpersonal planet in the order of the zodiac. It's not the first in the order of the solar system. As we know, Pluto, is in the outer edges after Neptune. But as a representative of Scorpio, this is where the journey begins, from coming all the way down, the underworld, the lower chakras, to start ascending back to the higher chakras. And then it's followed by Jupiter, which is the first sign that is immaterial, the first sign that goes beyond physical manifestation into the philosophy, the higher knowledge, and the larger meanings of life. And so it continues. And so Uranus represents the higher mind, which is, if you think about it from an anatomical point of view, Uranus also rules the brain, which is the highest organ in our body. And so the ability to stand on our own 2 feet and to be vertical, to point to the sky, as opposed to most other animals that are 4-legged, is part of this Uranian experience. So the difference between Mercury and Uranus, Mercury relates to the knowledge of this dimension and how we connect the dots to make it in this world. Whereas Uranus takes us to the transpersonal knowledge and to the ability to find new solutions to problems. So think about, we're going to unpack this a little bit more, but you can also expand on that. I have a whole article on my website on the octaves. I know the Venus, Neptune, the Mercury, Uranus, and the Pluto, Mars equations. And you also have videos for each one. So I think it's very rich and it's very important. And I encourage you to check it out. So Uranus basically takes the mercurial faculties beyond personal to the more spiritual and more big picture perspective, if you will. And so let's look more into the Mercury cycle. I'm referring here to a book by Gary Caton, who wrote about the Mercury elemental year. And I think it's a wonderful analysis and I would say unique material on Mercury and how complex Mercury and the cycle of Mercury really is. So check it out. So as you know, I will show you a little graphic. The cycle of Mercury around the sun is actually only 116 days from one inferior conjunction to a next one. And yet, because of its retrograde cycle, it retrogrades 3 times a year. From an astrological point of view, Mercury takes almost a year to go through the 12th sign because it's always close to the sun. And so it follows, from Earth perspective, it follows the sun positions. But that is not absolutely correct. That's not accurate if we just look at the revolution of Mercury around the sun itself. Maximum distance in the zodiac is 28 degrees. So Mercury can never be beyond 28 degrees. And if it is, either something changed in the solar system or you miscalculated. Retrograde 3 times a year, and the retrograde period varies. They're not all equal. The orbit of Mercury is slightly elliptical, as it is with most planets. And so it can take 2.5 to 3.5 weeks retrograde. It varies. It's obviously a personal planet, and it rules these 2 signs. A little bit about the mythology. I like to look at the mythology to understand the archetypes, but I will say very honestly, I don't limit the interpretation of a planet to mythology only, because we can also observe how a planet functions in the modern context of the 21st centuries. And the mythology is a starting point, but it's not the end point. So it's important to be flexible and also learn from direct experience how the planet operates, what it brings and activates. So Mercury is the Roman name for Hermes, who is the Greek version of Mercury, and heralds of the gods, god of commerce, eloquence, orators, messages, all the things we know about Gemini, and knowledge and bridging, one point, one person with another. Traveling, the travelers. So we tend to think of Mercury as short journeys only, but keep in mind that most people with strong Mercury and people with strong Gemini are going to be multicultural. Generally speaking, Mercurial people are very culture oriented. And so they can love to travel beyond the neighborhood. And that's where we need to kind of expand beyond the, you know, beyond the mythology and beyond our traditional understanding. Most Geminis are international people in their mindsets, in their culture. They're usually open-minded. They love, foreign cuisines and art. And so they will be travelers. They're not going to limit themselves to their immediate environment. Trickery and thieves, definitely a mercurial definition, but it's important to understand why. From an evolutionary astrology point of view, it's important to look at the outcome, but also source the intention. What's the intention of this trickery and of stealing? Is there humor in that, a sense of humor? Is it part of this Robin Hood mindset of distributing the goods from the wealthy to the the more needy population, the kind of bridging the different classes? And is trickery a survival necessity? Sometimes you have to, just like the animal totem that is represented with trickery is often the fox and the coyote. So the tricksters are excellent adaptive creatures. And we have to understand what is the survival intention in that. It's not just to harm others, or it's not just to basically create chaos just for the sake of entertainment. But there are deeper implications. The Hermes and Mercury are also guide the souls to the afterlife, which brings an interesting connection, obviously, to Pluto and to the underworld. Mercury was the only one who could go from the underworld to the upper world, which, from a chakra system point of view, is definitely important. So Mercury is kind of the conduit. And it's interesting that the god holds the caduceus, which is this staff that has the two snake intertwined. And if you look at the staff with the two snake, you definitely see kind of the symbol of Mercury with the horns, the semicircle of the snakes, and then the staff, kind of the axis that comes down. And so it looks very much like the symbol of Mercury. However, if we just look at the symbol, there is a different interpretation that the cross represents matter and incarnation, and the circle of spirit. And so we see this half circle, which is also spirit, connected to our integration into matter, and how Mercury kind of bridges the upper and the lower world, with the semicircle kind of absorbing higher knowledge and brings it down to the physical world, basically. So the caduceus, represents commerce and trade, and it was confused with the medical Asclepius staff, which traditionally in medicine has only one snake. So the Mercury two snakes is a different caduceus. That's why many people are actually debating whether it's a good symbol to use for medicine. But I think that since Mercury also rules Virgo, and Virgo is related to health and medicine, I think we can go beyond the traditional mythological association only and understand that there is a bleeding to medicine. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that this confusion between the two caduceus exists. Interestingly, Mercury also has winged sandals, which makes him very light and able to, travel those different worlds. So if I bring it down to our astrology, from the myth to application, ruling both Gemini and Virgo, Mercury really represents how we make our life work, how we manage our lives. So going back to to the traditional order of the wheel, Mercury rules the third sign. So Mars is the ignition of our consciousness. It's the engine starting our individuality, the baby separating from the mother to become an autonomous entity and starts, their own life. Then you have the second sign, Taurus, which has to do with actual incarnation, the body being, the soul being in the body. And that's why Venus relates to Neptune, because Neptune is spirit. Neptune is immaterial, whereas Venus is material, and Taurus is about physical beauty. If you think about that, you understand there's a natural dialogue and there's a natural friction, tension between the material and the spiritual. But that's what happened with Taurus, is that we actually ground our existence. And that's why it has to do with physical resources, solid food, and land ownership, growing your food and so forth. Then we move to Mercury, which is still in the first quadrant, and the first quadrant is immediately about survival. And Mercury realizes, as a mutable sign and mutable archetype, that everything is interconnected. And we move into the mind from the body to the mind, where we have to figure out how things work. So the Gemini functions are about navigation. Before even communication, it's about navigation. Where do I go? Where does it start? Where is the river flowing from? Where is it going? When is the salmon returning? All these facts that will help me understand where I am, where I landed in this life. And so the collection of information is, first of all, through observation. And that's why the mobility of Mercury is so important, because we go places, we climb a tree, we stream down the rivers to find things out. So the Gemini aspect is like piecing the pieces of a puzzle. And each day we have a new piece, a new realization, a new piece of information, which is a piece of a puzzle. Now, obviously, we all know that Gemini also has to do with communication, but before it has to do with communication, it has to do with language. And language is if you think about it deeply, how does language evolve? How does it even start? Think about the fact that Gemini squares Pisces naturally. And this square is everything, is related immediately to language, because Pisces is beyond language. Pisces is universal. In many ways, Pisces represents the ability to understand each other without language. When you're with someone and you feel so close, you don't need to explain yourself. You understand each other because you're on the same frequency, you're on the same mindset. So Pisces represents our ability to be beyond words. And that's why Mercury in Pisces, has a different relationship to language, is more poetic rather than facts and data. But the way language evolves is that the moment you have a word for something, it means you understand that thing. When there's no word in the English language for karma, for example, we had to import that word from India because our Western culture didn't perceive and didn't include reincarnation. So we didn't need a word for it, for karma, because it wasn't part of our cosmology. So when you understand something, you name it. When you understand that this is a tree, you give it a name, and that's how you build a vocabulary. So the more words you have, the vaster your understanding of life and its phenomena. So the naming of things then leads to language, and language then can lead to building bridges between people. And that's why we have different languages, because when I am in Iceland and my world is ice and winter, I have a different vocabulary than if I am in the jungles of Thailand. I will have different words and different sounds and different interpretations. So our environment informs our language as well and our vocabulary. But now that we travel much more and that we, go from Iceland to Thailand more easily, we see how language becomes more international, how languages bleed into each other more easily. So that is part of the Gemini function of Mercury. Now think about the other fact is that the more you know, the safer you are. And that is something we need to remember about Geminis, is that there's a survival imperative, that knowledge is not just entertainment. It's not just checking boxes. It's about sanity, survival. Because if you are informed, chances are you can avoid danger. You can be better prepared. And that takes us to the second mercurial sign of Virgo, which is get your life organized. So all the knowledge that has been absorbed and collected through the mercurial Gemini function can now be Earth Virgo applied. So Virgo basically uses the knowledge to make our life function. Function is Virgo. Does your life work? Do you get what you need? Are you safe? Are you able to produce? Virgo is the sign of the harvest. If you have a good harvest, it means you're doing things right. It means you're in tune with the weather, with the seasons, with the crops, with the bugs, with everything around you. So this ability to have this interdependent, again, mutable, interdependent work relationship with your environment and understand the function of an ecosystem, mutable ecosystem, multiple parts working together, is part of the Virgo function. The same way that we are part of an ecosystem, just here having this presentation, we rely on someone to provide the Zoom virtual connection and to provide computers and to provide microphones and to provide graphic design software. So our services as astrologers rely on the services of other people so that we can function and deliver what we are here to do effectively. So Virgo uses knowledge to gain control. The more I know, the better I can control my life. And that takes us to a very important quality with Mercury. Mercury in your life relates to your ability to control your life. Now, how important is that? If you are able to control your life, you can also predict and plan. If you're able to know the cycles of the sun, day and night, the seasons, the more information you have, the better prepared you can be for anything in your life. And that's part of what Virgo is about, is anticipation, which has to do with predictability, higher probabilities. Knowing is power, knowing where to go and what to do. Mercury also has to do with whether you're getting it or not. Whether you're able to synthesize information and know how things work. Not only how you make things work, but how things work as a whole. So this interplay between Gemini and Virgo is critical, and how they complement each other and rely on each other. And that's why Virgos and Virgos and Geminis usually get along, because they rely on each other and they function that way. And if we look at that, we know that the Mercury signs are opposing the Jupiter signs, Sag and Pisces, and the modern ruler of Neptune to Pisces. So where Mercury represents incarnation and represents knowledge, language, organizing our lives, making things work, the Jupiter signs represent what is beyond our control. Think about Pisces as the great mystery, which means it's the unknown. And what you cannot know is not in your control. It's the big picture perspective. So life begins actually with Pisces, with the universal everything. Then we're birthed into Aries. And so Pisces includes all that is, whether we know it or not. So the fact that, we discovered the planet Sedna in 2003 So our Mercury function found that there, through observation, that there is such a thing as a planet that's positioned there, and we ended up naming it Mercury, naming it Sedna after, the Inuit myth. Doesn't mean that Sedna didn't exist before we found out about it. So you see this relationship between the personal Mercury, I know, versus the impersonal Pisces. It's always been there. We just didn't know about it. And so this square between a Gemini and Pisces is this constant milking of information from the great pool of the great universal pool. So Pisces represent all that there is. It's the constant. It's there whether we know it or not. And Mercury tries to bring the unknown into the known. And then Virgo is about applying the knowledge gathered through Mercury to make life work, to bring control. And control is absolutely essential to our existence. We often glamorize letting go of control because our Western civilization is very mercurial. We over idealize sometimes our mercurial function, our ability to always know, to always be updated, to always organize everything and leave nothing to chance. So because Mercury provides that sense of security through control, we mastered it. And we can even see in many ways the dichotomy between Western civilization and more indigenous cultures, which are going to be more adaptive to the Pisces Sagittarius influences, because indigenous culture tend to accept more readily the unknown and the great spirit and the ancestors, and the fact that we need to surrender to a larger reality rather than being constantly on top of our game with Mercury. And yet, there are great necessities in Mercury. Think about the fact that Mercury is so instinctive because it's everything that you do automatically. Switch on the light, turn, the switch of your key in your car. What are you going to wear today? What are you going to eat for breakfast? How are you going to greet people? What is the sequence of actions that leads you, from one point to another, from one goal to another? All those things that you do because you know how to do them, and that become part of your everyday life and routine, that you don't even think about it anymore. It's automatic. It's part of that mercurial function. And the fact that you don't have to relearn everything every morning, right? You've learned certain things. Now it's part of you. It becomes second nature. So, the fact that you apply sunscreen as you go out on a hot day is your mercurial function of being in control and preventing a sunburn. And so it's extremely important in your way of life. But then, Pisces will kind of reflect and confront that and say, well, even if you put your sunscreen on and you thought, there would be a hot day, here is a sudden storm and you didn't bring your umbrella, and the universe is still full of surprises of twists and turns. So Mercury has to catch up constantly with how Neptune changes and brings new things to the tides and reveals hidden mysteries. And so Mercury, is with the notebook traveling into that world and trying to decipher the codes. Oh, why is the sky turning orange? And why is the tree not bearing fruits this year? And why is this animal behaving that way? Observation, data, notes, and hopefully coming up with some conclusion. So the Jupiterian signs reflect our right brain, which is where we intuit things, where we tap into the greater mysteries, whereas Mercury reflects the left brain, which is the categorizing, organizing, and our control abilities. In a nutshell, obviously, there's a lot more to it. So our way of thinking, our learning mechanism, how do we actually learn in our early schooling experience, navigation, and social skills? Quite often people with Mercury in Pisces are very awkward, or I will say can be very awkward, because they don't always understand the particularities of every situations. Pisces is a very global sign. It's, we're all one, we're all the same. And so it's not as tuned into the nuances of, oh, you're with the queen now, you need to bow down and be on your knee, or you're with, a colleague, and so you do this and that and another thing. All these cultural accepted norms are very foreign to Pisces. It's like, it doesn't make any sense to a Pisces to do these things. And so the social skills are very mercurial in that sense. And of course, as I said, as you build your skill and your knowledge, Mercury is immediately related to your skill set and to the way you manage your life, which also impacts your professional skills. Virgo is, I would say, one of the most masterful signs, because it's the sign that applies knowledge into function. And so through our Virgo quality, we polish our skills. We are going to be the best bakers, or the best drivers, or the best engineers. Wherever your Mercury is, and whatever is in your sixth house, shows how, what kind of skills you have, and how well you can do them. It doesn't always tell us, how far you went with that, but it gives us the direction of where, what you're good at manually as well as functionally and skill-wise. So matters that relate to employment and work dynamics is important. So when you look at transits of Mercury, you can also see what's going on at work. So when Saturn squares, or if, aspects your Mercury, or when Neptune aspects your natal Mercury, I'm talking about Neptune transit aspects your natal Mercury, you may lose your job. You may decide to leave your job, whether it's imposed on you or whether it's something you decide to do. varies from case to case. Usually, aspects to, let's say, Mars aspecting your Mercury can create a change in work dynamics. It can create disagreements at work. And in extreme cases, Mercury to Mars can also lead to quitting. I'm out of here. I'm angry. I don't want to work with these people anymore. So what I want to basically highlight is how important you need, to include Mercury in your professional analysis. I often, if we go back to these equations, to kind of the natural wheel of the zodiac, when Neptune opposes your Mercury, is a time where you cannot know. You cannot plan ahead. You have to improvise and to live more on a day-to-day basis, because things will be revealed as you go. So all your control needs are in a way compromised or relinquished. Now, if you have a Mercury Neptune aspect by transit, you may feel disoriented. You may feel like, oh my God, I don't know what to do now. I don't know. That's Neptune. Mercury wants to know. Neptune says you can't. Wait, be patient. Something will be revealed. This is why I often recommend clients, with this aspect, to take a break from their own lives, because it's a time to change your routine. It's a time to, not be on a tight schedule, not be in a rigid framework, even though it doesn't feel always safe and you can feel like you are disoriented. It's necessary. And that's the evolutionary intention. Always remember, what's the intention, even if you are in crisis. So if you're born with Mercury Neptune, then that's kind of your mode of operation. You're not a planner. And that's how you make things work. And that's what I'm going to get into briefly here. How does that work in each sign? So Mercury in Aries, from how we make things work and how we work. So Mercury in Aries, energy makes things work. Mercury in Aries are going to be goal-oriented, entrepreneur in their in their profession. These are people who need autonomy at work. They cannot be constantly told what to do and follow orders. They need that agency to be creative, to try new things. And their employer need to respect that, because they're going to get the best results. So if you infuse energy into a project, it's going to work. And that's how Mercury and Aries make things work. They energize. Whereas Taurus brings flavor to what they do. It's not enough to just have a goal or to press buttons. There needs to be a sense to that. There needs to be flavor to that. It needs to feel good. It needs to lead to a pleasant experience. So it brings flavor and texture. But Mercury in Taurus is very methodical and quite solitary. They're not, they very much introverted and are not very good at working in teams. They rely on themselves. Their ideas are assets. The Gemini way of making things work is to figure things out quickly. The faster you get it, the better your chances of making things work. So the mental scanning, the ability to synthesize multiple sources and to understand context. I'm here in the desert. You're there in the jungle. You are having an audience with your CEO. Understand where you are and what's appropriate for every situation is part of that mercurial function in Gemini. Cancers are, how to put it, they need to feel it. So whatever they do, there's a feeling quality, and they need to relate to what they're doing. So a Mercury in Cancer will never succeed to just work for the money, to just do something that pays the rent, because they need to feel personally involved, personally attached to what they're doing. And it needs to resonate with them. So there's a lot of authenticity with Cancer. And they're not going to eat what they don't like just because, they're not going to be polite about it. And so it's a very particular Mercury. And yet it's, one way to understand Cancer is that they are the best writers. If you want to write a novel, if you need a ghostwriter, find a Mercury in Cancer, or you with Mercury in the fourth house or Cancer are usually very, very good because they're going to give to each sentence, to each word, there's going to be an emotion. It's going to be relatable. Where Mercury in Gemini can write information and deliver data, Mercury in Cancer is the storyteller. It takes you on a journey. It involves you in the script, in the unfolding. And that's how they function. So it needs to be personal for things to work. Mercury in Leo is happening right now, and it's about to turn retrograde. Mercury in Leo brings importance to everything. Everything's important. No detail is random for a Mercury in Leo. So how is the light in the room? And how is the food? And what is your morning ritual? And what is the view that you're having? Everything needs to make sense and everything is important. So that's why Mercury in Leo tend to be late for everything, because if everything's important, you spend time on every detail and you can talk about every detail over dramatically because it's important. So they're not very good with editing. If you're a Mercury in Leo and you're writing something, you need an editor and cut what's important, really, what's relevant. I won't say it's not important, but what is relevant. Obviously, very creative idea and purpose. Everything has purpose with Mercury in Leo. So why are you, drinking your shake in the morning? Why are you driving that car? Everything has an intention and a purpose. So they're infusing life into every task to make things work. Virgo, knowing and planning for the best outcome, being prepared for the steps, details make things work. If you're aware of the details, you know how to organize them and you get the results from that. So it can be an extremely analytical Mercury who pays attention, following Leo where everything's important. Virgo knows how to place things. So some things do have different levels of importance. And organizing all the details make things work. Libra is theorizing and offering different perspectives. Libra finds knowledge by listening. I'm going to listen to the Palestinian, I'm going to listen to the Israeli, and I'm going to theorize what can make things work. So there can be a lot of spinning with Mercury in Libra because there's a lot of what if this, and what if that, and what if we would include that perspective. So they tend to float more into the abstract spheres and not be immediately practical. But that's part of how they make things work, is that they want to understand a bigger picture, a more global perspective on things, and the sharing of resources. So the cooperation is what makes things work. Scorpio discerns because Scorpio has everything to do with trust. So Mercury in Scorpio doesn't trust knowledge without testing it, without finding the source. So it's a very particular, again, water Mercury that's going to want more focus. Once it's discerning, it's going to nail on what they want and the way things work and go into that very, soul and body. And whatever they do, the way they function has to have impact. It needs to hit. So they're the snipers. It's precise and it's impactful, but that requires a lot of backstage, behind the scene analysis. So their discernment is usually through emotional intelligence, intuition, reading between the lines. It's an emotional Mercury, and trust plays an important role in what they choose from what they reject. And they can see a lot of information that other people don't see. Sagittarius brings large concepts. So how to bring a big, large vision into a practical application. So this kind of dichotomy between the big picture and the day-to-day. So ideally, a Mercury in Sagittarius, their skill is to be able to expand and yet keep it functional, practical, without getting carried away. And that can be, a work in progress. Believing is manifesting. If you envision something, you're halfway making it work. Capricorn is obviously strategic. And like Scorpio, very discerning, doesn't trust easily. But the parameters of discernment are different for Capricorn. Capricorn wants to test things over time. It has to do with experience. And that's why they rely on the knowledge of elders. And that's why they can be very judgmental when they get, oh, these modern astrologers are fanciful, they bring all kinds of new ideas into the mix and it's not being tested. So there's something about relying on years of experience and being more suspicious of information and functions that are not, that are too juvenile or too raw. It wants the good wine, Capricorn. And so it doesn't like to waste time. And I'm not going to waste my time on fanciful theories. I want to go straight to the master and learn from them. So how to make things work is reliability. And Aquarius obviously is a mind that needs to push beyond existing pattern. It's the higher mind. And so if you're used to do something a certain way, Aquarius will immediately see the drawbacks, the failures. So, remember that Aquarius is a higher Mercury, which also means they're extremely critical and can immediately see where things are not working, dysfunction. But instead of fixing something with what is already there, they're going to try to bring a new solution. It's like Einstein saying you can't fix a problem with the mind that created it. It's a very Aquarian way of saying it because he had Uranus in the third house. So that, you also apply the planets in your third house, the sign in your third house and sixth house to find out how this applies to you. So he had Mercury in Aries, but Uranus in the third, and anticipating the future makes things work. So they see not just what's going on now, but how things will unfold. And so again, a greater, larger perspective. Pisces, experience is your worst enemy, says Pisces. That's the clash of Pisces and Capricorn. We think it's a sextile and they get along, but they don't. Because Pisces is about the unknown and the things you cannot control. So your experience is actually going to mislead you. Come with a blank slate, says Pisces. Learn as you go. Be in tune with the moment to know what comes next and how to proceed. Don't overanalyze. So it's the art of not being prepared, because it's the art of improvising, and you need a lot of confidence to be able to improvise. So if you're a musician with Mercury in Capricorn, you're going to read your notes. You're going to be perfect your symphony and your melody based on the existing structure of music. Whereas the Pisces Mercury will go on tangents, will be inspired by the crowd in front of them and come up with something that is completely unexpected. But this is why there's a risk with Mercury in Pisces to get lost into tangents, to lose the point and the plot if you meander too much and you forget, the initial intention. You go to a music concert and then you end up talking about dessert recipes. So it's kind of that associative way of thinking. And, Mercury in Pisces can be excessive that way, get lost in their speeches and in their way of doing things. So they have to kind of bring it back, hone it back to avoid that kind of risk. I'm going to show you now. So this is the cycle of Mercury. Mercury is the inner planet here. The Earth is on the blue cycle. And so this is how you can more easily visualize the retrograde, how the retrograde works. The moment Mercury comes between the Earth and the Sun, it goes retrograde, and then it leaves and goes behind the Sun for the direct. Okay? So This leads me to this next slide. The cycle and the phases of Mercury. So Mercury is that inner planet. We have Venus orange, and you have Mars on the outer wheel. So Mercury, when it comes between the sun and the earth, that's when we perceive it as retrograde. And that's going to be an interior conjunction, Sun-Mercury. And then when it goes behind the sun, it's also conjunct in our perspective because they're in the same zodiacal place, but it's going to be an exterior conjunction. So when Mercury is direct with the sun, it's behind the sun. When Mercury is retrograde with the sun, it's between Earth and sun. And what happens is, I'm going to now speak about briefly the elemental year of Mercury. Mercury conjuncts the sun when retrograde. It's what we often refer also to as Cazimi. And the retrogrades happen, the Cazimis happen in the same element 4 to 6 times consecutive. So our current cycle is a fire cycle. Our upcoming, Mercury is now in Leo and is going to conjunct the sun on July 31st, 2025 at 9 degrees Leo. So during the retrograde period, that is going to be a key moment of activation. This is when the retrograde can bring its fruit or can activate the mercurial functions of our lives in a different way. Why do I focus on the retrograde? Because when Mercury goes retrograde is when we are able to develop our mercurial functions. This is when we can learn something new because it takes us off course. When Mercury is direct, you follow what you know. So you're in autopilot. You tend to just follow your routine. When it goes retrograde, you suddenly realize that things are not working, that you need some changes, that you're not satisfied at work, whatever, depending on house and sign. So in other words, focusing on the Cazimi retrograde, the interior conjunction, gives us a lot of information about what's going on in the world, not just personally, but globally, how the culture can change. So we are now on our last fire retrograde. So from April 2024 to now, July 2025, we were in fire mode. And now we're moving. In November, we're going to have our first water cycle. And that is going to be going until June 2027, a year and a half, with 5 water retrogrades. Now, 5 and not 6, because one of them will actually be on the edge of water. It's going to be a 29 Aquarius, not quite Pisces, in February 2027, and then go back to water in June 2027. So pay attention to the fact that we're entering a water cycle from fire to water. So that is a huge shift. And we don't, astrologers don't pay attention to that enough, if they know about it at all. because it changes the climate of how we do things, not just on a personal, but on a global level. So during the fire cycle, everything is exuberant. You have a lot of creativity, wild ideas. It tends to be more contentious. There's more protesting happening during the fire cycle. It's also very much about what you want to do with your life and what you want to change in your life. So fire intensify individuality. When we get into water, we touch on the vulnerabilities. So this is when we can start to see that things are not so safe, that trust is being shaken. So it can bring a lot of vulnerabilities to systems, to our routines, to our trust. And if we look, we see that the elemental retrograde is parallel to a direct Kazemi in another element. So the fire cycle of retrograde was merging with the air retrograde. And now with water retrograde, we're moving with the earth direct, which is much more conservative, right? Fire is change oriented. Water brings vulnerabilities. If we look back at water cycles, 2019, we paid attention to a lot of relinquishing, and even COVID pandemic, started in a water cycle. Whereas fire was a lot of freedom and flammable situations, raging protests. And yet, India decriminalizes homosexuality. Saudi women allowed to drive. So a lot of breakthroughs, different climate. It's interesting, just a fact of what's going on now. Mercury just turning retrograde, and there was this event at a Coldplay concert where they spotlighted people in the crowd, and they ended up spotlighting a couple who immediately ran away from the camera. So think about Mercury retrograde in Leo, where you get the spotlight right on you in a venue that is very Leonian, big concert, big band, and yet it's for the wrong reason as far as you're concerned, because you want to hide with your mistress and lover. So, which is also a Leonian situation. So that kind of captures very much what went on. But we can anticipate that they probably have something at 1 Aries in their chart with Saturn, Neptune, exposing them in this forbidden light. Anyway, I talked a lot. I hope there's time for questions.
Wow, Maurice, what a wonderfully insightful and thought-provoking presentation. It's been a great privilege to have you with us here today. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I'm sure I'm not alone, and I could listen to you for hours and all day, like many people here, and I'm sure you can see all the hearts and coming through on the screen. So, do you have a few minutes for some questions, for some Q&A?
Sure. And
Fantastic.
And we obviously will continue and expand on that on August 3rd for the next webinar.
Absolutely. And do forgive me, everybody here, that we might not be able to get to everybody's questions. But if you do sign up for the workshop, that usually a lot smaller environments where you can jump in with your questions in the workshop. And we'll put another link in the chat as well. Okay, so diving into the questions, do you consider the pre-shadow and post-shadow of Mercury retrograde as 2 weeks before and after?
Absolutely. but particularly the week before. I will say, I often laugh when I hear astrologers who run to sign a contract, 3 hours before Mercury turns retrograde, thinking that it won't affect it. The retrograde has to do with speed. And so the fact that Mercury is slowing down to change direction already puts us in that reality. So the retrograde effect begins prior to the actual moment it turns retrograde. And this, this example with the concert is a good one because Mercury was not retrograde yet, but it already, was delivering, so to speak.
Not a great time for those two, I'm sure. And talking about contracts and things of this nature, this is an interesting question. So if someone wants to apply for a visa to another country, should they apply during a Mercury retrograde, or should they prepare all the paperwork during the retrograde period, then apply once the planet turns direct? What are your thoughts about this?
I am one who embraces Mercury retrograde. And the reason is that Mercury retrograde works very well if you know how to improvise and if you are open to more fluid development. For example, if you are rigid in your planning, then the Mercury retrograde can mess things up. But if you're open to, to try a new cuisine, or I will say, personally, an example is that I bought two cars, which is cars of Mercury. I bought two cars during a Mercury retrograde, and they were the best cars I ever had in terms of efficiency and quality. And the reason is that both time the purchase was not planned. And it ended up being a very good surprise. So Mercury retrograde is a time where you open yourself to the Neptune opposition. So it invites improvisation. It invites a more fluid approach, adaptability. And then you get a lot of the wow, aha, and revelations. So as
Wonderful.
far as the visa, one thing I tend to avoid is to avoid stations. When Mercury stations to retrograde or stations to go direct, basically when Mercury is very slow or not moving, I wouldn't initiate new things. But if Mercury is in the middle of the retrograde and it's at full speed, I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think this was to do with something earlier in the presentation, but someone is asking, is it common for Western astrology to use Eastern concepts like chakras in its interpretation? I am familiar with chakras through my yoga studies. Though I am new to astrology, I am curious when these two practices started to overlap. Thank you.
Well, evolutionary astrology is definitely inspired by Eastern philosophies of reincarnation and definitely the chakra system as well. So it tends to be more of a modern approach, and maybe Vedic astrologers also incorporate that. But at the end of the day, it's all about life. Astrology is about everything that exists. And so Eastern or Western all become one.
This is a very common question coming through right now. So, how do you see Mercury retrograde in the natal chart? And does that change how one is affected by Mercury cycles in your experience?
I missed the question. Can you repeat it?
There's quite a few similar questions talking about Mercury retrograde in the natal chart. So,
Okay.
how do you see that? How does that change, or how is one affected by the Mercury cycles or the retrograde by transit, going retrograde transit?
I'm not of the opinion that if you have Mercury retrograde at birth, that you don't experience the setbacks or the changes that the transit retrograde brings. I think it applies to everyone, especially in the Western world, where it tends to be a more linear world, where even people born with Mercury retrograde tend to be, in the Western culture, very linear. So the Mercury retrograde takes us away from rigid linearity. And so if you do that naturally, then the retrograde is easier for you, whether you have it natally or not. But I have seen people with Mercury retrograde really get into messed up situations when it turns retrograde again, and their life gets complicated. Um, lack of focus, a lot of scattered energy and whatnot. So I wouldn't say one size fits all.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see here. I should have asked this question earlier on, but what is your preferred house system? Because as we know, with multiple house systems, you can change that Mercury into houses sometimes. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I use quadrant house system, which means the ascendant will be the first house, and then Coke, Porphyry. But, every house system, just like every environment, geographical environment, has a purpose. So the equal house or the whole sign have a purpose. If you are using certain techniques, if you're looking for certain answers, that house system may work better for you. But for my practice, as far as evolutionary and soul journey and understanding purposes on that level, the quadrant house system is preferable because the ascendant degree and opening, as a starting point of houses, plays an important role.
wonderful, thank you. Let's see, last couple of questions here. There's a question about Saturn from the professional perspective. That might be a great question for the slide we've got up here, which is for the workshop on vocational. But there's another question here. How would Maurice suggest balancing the natural Mercury Virgo Pisces and Gemini Sagittarius axis influence of thought versus expansion?
That's why traditionally Mercury is considered weaker or detriment in Sag and in Pisces, because these are non-linear signs and they tend to, expand to the abstract. My perspective is that it's not necessarily a bad thing. Somebody with Mercury in Virgo can be over analytical and anxious as a result. And so, people with Mercury in their own sign do not necessarily have better lives, so to speak. Whereas, a Mercury in Pisces can feel the happy-go-lucky and be more of the gypsy person who will embrace this embrace improvisation. So it's a skill. I'm not saying that it doesn't have its risk, but that is part of the evolutionary lesson with Pisces, Mercury 12th house or 9th house, and Sag. It's how to bring the big picture into the tangible, functional, day-to-day life. And it is possible. It can work. That's how big projects end up changing our lives and the world, is the ability to think big, but to know how to be strategic about it.
I love that explanation. As a Mercury in Pisces myself, that is so on point. Thank you so much. And again, forgive me, everybody, we're not going to get to everyone's questions today, but if you do join the workshop, this would be a great place to ask more questions to Maurice. And again, Maurice, it's such a great privilege to have you at Kepler College. So on behalf of Kepler College, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today all around the world. And just to reiterate, we'll have the replay up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And of course, you can look through all the slides and all of those. I don't know if you can see all the hearts and everything coming through, but absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Many blessings. Until then.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.